Hey, how's it going, guys? This is your boy Hazzed, and today on the Battle for Azeroth beta, they have decided to make the new Frost DK changes implemented into the new Battle for Azeroth build. So what we're going to do is go ahead and take a look at these talents, discuss potential builds, and go into a little bit more detail about abilities after I've had a full day of testing a lot of these and finding out where the, good DPS is at with certain specs. So, let's do this.
It's who we are, it's what we do, we've come so far. And now we pay the price, so don't even cry. The world is breaking down, and I cannot leave the ground.
So let's start off right now by looking into these talents and kind of discussing what they're good for and what they're not good for. We've got Icy Talents, which ends up being one of the best out of the top tier talents. Shattering Strikes is okay, but since they buffed up Runic Attune, Shattering Strikes is kind of on the back burner for now. Inexorable Assault is actually pretty good, being that you don't have to be in combat for that ability to stack up, and it stacks up to 5 times passively, giving you an opener burst damage of, really anything. In PvE, PvP, gonna give you a little bit more damage within the next 5 obliterates on a target. So if you time that correctly, it could actually give you some fairly good peak burst on an opener. But I'd say overall DPS and for PvE wise, Icy Talons is going to be the way to go, being that it's combined with Runic Attune, which was buffed up to proccing 3 runic power instead of 1 runic power, making it a much better ability. Obviously, it's also going to give us a little bit more healing and a little bit more death strikes in the long run to help us keep our Frost Death Knight alive. Now, I did test out Murderous Efficiency and Horn of Winter, which Horn of Winter is fairly good when combined with Breath, but in my opinion, Runic Attune has just been buffed to being quite a bit stronger than both those talents in the long run when it comes to single target DPS. So Runic Attune is going to be the way I'll be heading at the moment for current PvE. As far as level of 58 talent, obviously we got Asphyxiate, we got our stun back on Death Knights. As far as PvP goes, this is like, this is one of the best things that we could have got. Honestly, getting back our 45-second stun to allow us to get some healing off, allow us to get some damage off, allow us to burst. Maybe if you're using breath spec, it's going to allow you to get a full breath on a target. It does quite a lot for us Frost DKs, and especially since it's on a 45-second cooldown, you'll be able to play quite a few trinkets as far as arena-wise goes. As for level 60 talents, I kind of tested these out before the patch. My favorite was Glacial Advance. Ice Cap has actually been changed. It's level 60 talent. I thought it was going to be in the level 100 categories, what the notes said, but it seems they've decided to change that around a little bit. So what we got going on here is Avalanche. That has been changed. It no longer procs off of melee attacks that fall on your target. It now procs off of only granting a Rhyme proc with Howling Blast, which in my opinion is going to lower our initial burst, but what it does do is bring up our overall DPS, because any Howling Blast proc you get through the entire dungeon, through the entire BG, is going to cause Avalanche to fall on the target. And it turns out that this is going to be our go-to for major AoE consistency inside of dungeon situations. And that's really where Frost DK's strength at the moment comes into play, is the constant AoE pressure they can put through a dungeon. They really don't drop below about, I'd say at least my character doesn't drop below 10k on any pull in an entire dungeon with Avalanche running because of the consistent AoE. Now Glacial Advance will give you a little bit more opener burst, but I'd say in the long run it definitely falls behind Avalanche when you're DPSing for quite a while on multiple targets. Just the fact that Avalanche is always there, it's always there, and you're going to be getting quite a few Howling Blast procs, and because Howling Blast is one of your major damaging abilities, you'll be using it as priority over a lot of your other things, especially because of the level 100 talents. So let's go ahead and talk about level 75. We got Death Pact, we got our heal back outside of Death Strike, something we needed. Both that and Asphyxiate is just like, we are so much better off in PvP that it is ridiculous at the moment. Like, where we went from where we jumped to in viability is out of this world compared to where we were in 1v1 situations. So going into the level 90 talents, this is where it kind of gets interesting, and we'll have to go a little bit more detail into this when it comes to DPSing on some dummies. But we've got Gathering Storms, which is staying absolutely the same, which is fairly good at consistency DPS, and it's fairly good at AoE situations when you're first hitting a target. but it's also competing with Frostworm's Fury, which turned out to be an amazing ability here, but the 3-minute cooldown is definitely the thing that's going to bring it down in PvE situations, being that it could help you burst up quite a bit higher in your major initial burst, but overall, Gathering Storms is going to give you a lot better consistency, DPS, and single target pressure, and it's also going to give you better AoE consistency throughout the fight. Combined with Avalanche, you got quite a bit of AoE consistency pressure throughout the dungeon. Does really well. But overall, Frostworm's Fury hits extremely hard. Even though it's on a 3-minute cooldown, I believe it's even more powerful than it was in Legion in comparison to a Frost DK. Now, I'm not 100% sure if it's scaling off of attack power or not. We could actually check right now. Just to make sure that it is, or if it isn't, or it's just a baseline damage ability. I'm going to go ahead and proc up a trinket here that's going to proc up, close to 1,000 strength, and it's either going to increase the damage or it's not going to do anything. So we'll go ahead and pop that, and it seems that it is scaling off of attack power. So if you have any kind of major strength trinket, kind of like I do here, it's going to make Frostworm's Fury do amazing damage. And of course, if you combine that with Blood Fury, you're going to see quite big Frostworm Furies. I'm not used to saying that name yet. But overall, I've seen this ability, at least on major AoE, if there's more than 5 targets, it can peak to over 100k DPS openers on targets. Of course, you were going to proc up your Fallen Crusader, or your Rune of Fallen Crusader, make sure you get that extra strength buff, proc up that trinket, proc up Blood Fury, and you're going to see numbers that I don't think any class in the game can put up besides a Frost DK with that much AoE burst pressure. So in terms of the highest AoE burst in the game, that's going to go to Frostworm's Fury by far. So we're going to go ahead and start talking about these level 100 talents. We got Freezing Fog, which is kind of interesting. I expected Freezing Fog to be in the level 60 category with the other consistency AoE abilities, but instead they decided to put it in the level 100 category. Not 100% sure why, but I'm okay with it because it turns out Freezing Fog is actually amazing for consistent damage with this build, being that you're generating the majority of your AoE off of Howling Blast and Avalanches to cause those to fall down on the enemies, deal quite a bit more pressure, and of course you're spamming Obliterates with Gathering Storms to generate a lot more AoE consistency and single target with the build up off of that. And it really just has great synergy with this spec altogether, because even when you're not bursting, you're benefiting from Icy Talons, and of course since you're running Runic Attune, you're going to have endless amount of Frost Strikes to drop on the target. And since we do have Azerite armor, now finally able to use some of our 340 Azerite armor. As you can see at the top, this one's Contagion, which deals a bit of frost damage over 14 seconds, which isn't really amazing, but you see from some of these other ones, like this one, Latent Chill, Frost Strike deals an additional 752 damage if you have at least 3 empty runes. With this build, you're not prioritizing Frost Strikes. You could be, but you're not necessarily prioritizing them. Being as it may, you end up dumping Frost Strikes for the majority of time running with Runic Attune, which actually helps that ability deal more DPS for your Frost DK because it enhances the damage if you have at least 3 empty runes, and it turns out to be, again, great synergy for the talents. Now, there are a few other things that kind of buff up that. There are, oh, hold on, let me bring up some Azerite chest pieces here. I don't believe it's chest piece, I think it's shoulder piece. This ability alone, Echoing Howl, which I'm pretty excited to use in PvE situations. If I had better shoulders, I'd be using it quite a bit. It empowers your Rhyme. Howling Blast causes a secondary burst of icy wind around you that deals 872 frost damage to all nearby enemies. So if you've got 6 or 7 enemies and that hits for 800, a couple of them crits, you could be looking at, basically 1,000 plus damage for each of those guys out there, which would be a huge DPS increase to your Howling Blast spec overall. So fairly excited for that. Now, Pillar of Frost just basically works like Obliteration does, and in my opinion, not nearly as effective as Freezing Fog because in AoE situations, surprisingly, being as your melee attack ends up being one of your highest DPS, so does your AoE dot damage and a lot of downtime consistency situations. So Pillar of Frost is kind of meh in my opinion. I'm not even going to be looking towards it. I mean, we'll go ahead and put it on and throw it up, but it's nothing really, it's nothing great. As you can see, there's no strength increase. We do have Pillar of Frost up, we do have the Obliteration effect, but overall it's not that great. If it had a little bit of a strength increase or something along those lines, it would definitely be worth using, but the way it is just stock not that great of a talent anymore, and most likely we're going to be avoiding it, being that we have two better choices. We could either take that consistency from Freezing Fog, or we can get that crazy opener burst from Running Breath. Now, Breath is kind of an interesting talent that kind of comes with good side and a downside. If you want to get maximum burst running a Frost DK, you would be running Inexorable Assault, Frostworm's Fury, and Breath of Sindragosa, which we'll take a look at that here in a second, and I'll explain how to go about that. And it's kind of like, I'd say, Night Hold Breath, something along those lines. But overall, it's going to give you a lot more initial burst. It's going to give you a lot more upfront burst, but overall consistency is going to start lacking in comparison to Freezing Fog, since more than likely it's not going to keep up in the long run. It won't keep up in the long run. It just won't. So what do I got to say about Frost with these talents being considered is we have some of the best AoE consistency in the game. We lost a bit of burst in the transition going from the last patch to this patch, but considering we gained CC and some self-healing, which was totally worth the loss, by the way. Totally worth the loss. We needed that more than just about anything in the game. But overall, I'd have to say the Freezing Fog build's going to do the best in PvE situations currently for overall consistency. And then if you wanted to run more upfront burst, you could go Frostworm's Fury, Breath of Sindragosa, or Inexorable Assault to give you a little bit more burst on contact. But overall, Inexorable Assault's going to knock you down. Frostworm's Fury, since it's a 3-minute cooldown, is going to make you deal a lot less consistency DPS inside of dungeons, whether it's you decide to use your Frostworm's Fury on bosses or you decide to use it on mobs. It's either going to make one or the other lacking. So you got to kind of keep that in your head while going after this ability. But in PvP situations, it's definitely going to be the largest bursting talent you can take in that situation. Same with Breath of Sindragosa. So we are going to have kind of some interesting choices once PvP, more of the PvP testing rolls around. So with this talent build, you're not really going to get extreme bursting. You're not going to get really anything above 30,000. You might do it if you're really, really lucky on procs. But again, because this relies on Howling Blast procs, it's going to be very proc orientated. But the chances are you are going to get a Howling Blast proc within the first 3 obliterates, which is going to push up your DPS by quite a bit. If you can get it on the first or second obliterate, it's going to push up your DPS and your overall DPS in AoE situations by quite a bit further. So what we're going to do on these targets, let's say we want to come in and burst on them, we would throw up Blood Fury, we'd throw up our Trinket, which do not rely on global cooldowns anymore, so that's fairly good. We're going to throw up Remorseless Winter, we're going to come in and just start spamming our obliterates, trying to grant us a Howling Blast proc, and there it is. And that's when our DPS is going to start skyrocketing, because our big Howling Blast damage is coming out, and of course the Avalanche procs residing off of those is going to deal quite a bit of damage too. Now the nice thing about the Frost spec is Empowered Rune Weapon. Right now it's on a 1-minute cooldown, but it does reside on a 2-minute cooldown outside of world PvP situations, and deals quite a bit of DPS since it increases our haste as baseline. It basically works just like Empowered Rune Weapon now instead of Empowering Rune Weapon, making us deal quite a bit of AoE consistency and of course single target consistency if it's, let's say, a boss fight. So overall, Frost DKs do not have the most insane burst in the world as some of the other classes, but you can see that definitely their strongest trait, or our strongest trait when it comes to PvE, is going to be that consistency, because that big change from relying on Pillar of Frost to just relying on Howling Blast procs to deal a ton of AoE pressure is going to overall make us a better class when just doing baseline DPS, because we're no longer required to use that major 20% strength increase to make us deal quite a bit of DPS. Our baseline is a lot stronger as Frost DKs, as you can see there, and we're able to keep up a lot of DPS and a lot of single target DPS and a lot of AoE DPS consistently with this spec. And I really do like the playstyle of it. I thought I wouldn't, but overall it does feel pretty nice with this spec. It kind of reminds me of see, what was it? I don't remember exactly which raid it was at this point. One of the raids we were running Howling Blast spec really hard. I really don't remember what one it was. Wow. Surprisingly, we were running Howling Blast spec really hard. We were building it all in our runics, And we definitely seem to kind of loop around back towards that time where Howling Blasts are going to be extremely powerful coming into the new expansion. So overall AoE pressure with this spec is quite nice. Now we do need to talk about single target pressure on a Frost DK because I feel like that was the thing that was mostly affected with eliminating Pillar of Frost, or changing it, not technically eliminating it, is the overall single target ability of this spec. Now, it is fairly good when it comes to consistency, but overall, if you're going to generate any kind of maximum single target burst, you're going to need Frostworm's Fury or Breath of Sindragosa to compete with some of the other very bursty classes. Otherwise, they could dwarf a lot of your damage, but overall, in the long run, you could catch up quite easily with this spec, since it is a fuller rotation than a lot of classes have. So I'm going to go ahead and open up on this target, just pop those few abilities, and we'll go ahead and talk about burst a little bit. Now, as you can see, it's kind of the same concept as DPSing on multiple targets. A lot of your damage is basically going to come from your big frost strikes, your big howling blast proccing up, and of course it'll slowly proc up your DPS a little bit higher as soon as empowered rune weapon sits in, and we're sitting around 10k. Now the nice thing about frost DKs is they're really not going to fall too much beneath that 10k peak. Now if you wanted to deal 14k, 16k, even a little bit higher than that in single target DPS, you would definitely have to go Breath of Sindragosa build with a little Frost Worm to proc up quite a bit more damage, and we'll go ahead and show that here in just a second. As you can see, the single target DPS does not seem great. It doesn't seem as good as a lot of the other classes, but the nice thing about Frost spec is it changes a lot based on proc. And of course, when new talents and new abilities proc back up, you'll deal quite a bit more DPS. It's very up and down. It keeps a nice consistent DPS, but it has a bit of up and down when it comes to proccing certain abilities. But overall, Frost DK's DPS doesn't fall nearly as much as other classes as soon as off stats come into play. So we'll go ahead and talk about some of these other specs and talk about what you got to do with those. Alright, so here we got a variation of the breath spec, and I'm going to go ahead and talk to you guys about dealing maximum burst and stuff we could do in world PvP situations that's going to make us I wouldn't say strong, but definitely stronger, since we can get away with using breath spec in PvP now, being that we have death packs. So of course, if we're dying in the middle of breath, we don't have to resort to using death strikes, completely kill our breath, and we'll be able to use death pack instead to kind of push us through that little opener damage to deal quite a bit of DPS if you like running breath spec. So we're going to go ahead and open up on the target. You could get about 2 obliterates, maybe 3 obliterates, but most likely 2, and get just enough runic power that you can throw up Breath of Sindragosa, and of course pop empowered rune weapon. I do need to change a couple of my macros to run my on-use stuff a little bit better there, because I just got this trinket surprisingly, and it works really well for Frost DK. So we're going to go ahead and throw up those 2 abilities, run in with Remorseless Winter. We got off our 2 damages there, and we're going to go ahead and pre-pop Empower as we get on the target to deal quite a bit of DPS, and somewhere in there is where you throw your big dragon off, dealing up to about 17k DPS there, which was actually the peak of the previous Frost spec before the changes. And I gotta admit, even though I'm dealing about the same amount of burst with these abilities, I am enjoying the damage a heck of a lot better than I previously was. And being that even though we lost Pillar of Frost, we've got Runic Attune and a couple things to make up for our consistency DPS, making that overall quite a bit better than it was. And as you can see, my DPS with this spec was almost double what it was with the other build. But of course, after that, since I'm not running the Freezing Fog plus Howling Blast build, our damage is going to start lacking in the long run using the Breath Frostworm build, Frostworm's Fury build. Still able to deal an insane amount of pressure. So if we're talking PvP situations and we needed to kill a healer or something along those lines, it would definitely help us in the long run to go ahead and deal that insane burst DPS. And I'm really excited to test out a lot of this stuff in PvP situations, because I feel like this could be like one of those killing somebody in 4 to 5 seconds if done correctly inside PvP instances, because that Frost Breath, it hits really hard. It hits super hard in comparison to a lot of other abilities. We saw with just the Vial of Animated Blood procced up and a little bit of Blood Fury, we could probably get it to hit for about 3.2, and if it crits, it could hit for 50 to 60k. You get multiple targets on that, and Frost DK's damage just goes absolutely insane. So the new changes, let's go ahead and sum up these new changes. So let's go ahead and sum up these new Frost changes with a little bit of questioning, I guess you could say. Is Frost DK good? I'd have to say yes. The overall consistency and single target consistency seems to be very good for Frost DKs, and in terms of having our stun and our heal back, totally worth the revamping. Frost DKs went from a class that wasn't very good in world PvP situations to something that's definitely a lot more viable, and of course in PvP situations, because of the CC, we're going to have a lot more survivability, and of course killability on targets, being that we have a 45 single target stun, and of course being that it doesn't reside on our Remorseless Winter, makes this all around a much better class, and being that of course we had the secondary heal involved, was something that was astronomical for Frost DKs that we again really needed. But DPS wise, I'd have to say the burst spec seems to be fairly interesting for PvP situations. I'm going to be having quite a bit of fun trying to test that out. I also think the other spec's going to deal quite a bit of AoE pressure inside of major PvP situations, since it is more of a consistency spec. Instead of relying on Pillar of Frost, you're going to be able to deal that damage on a much more consistent basis, most likely, more than likely, relying on a 1 minute cooldown empowering rune weapon, which being that that's on a much shorter cooldown than previously, since they did nerf it. It was at a 3 minute cooldown on empower, and then that would make it 1.5 minute cooldowns, but since they reduced empowered rune weapon down to 2 minutes, of course it's going to be on a 1 minute cooldown in PvP or world PvP situations, making that ability very strong since it grants 15 haste, and as we know on any classes that reach 120, the off stats are absolutely terrible. Alright, so 15% haste is kind of like a world changing event for a character that's 120 at the moment. So what could be better? What's my overall review there? I really feel like Frost DKs are lacking burst damage. They do have quite a bit of consistency, but I think their overall burst damage is definitely lacking in comparison to what it previously was, which is something I expected to see. It is, being that we lost Pillar of Frost. Our definite burst is a lot lower than it used to be, but our overall consistency and consistency damage is a lot higher. So it's kind of like we had to trade up a little bit of our burst for more CC and self-healing, which is something I've kind of foreseen, and I definitely was willing to give up in the long run as a Frost DK just to make sure we got CC and healing back. So I could definitely see why they did that change. But overall, I feel like there's going to need to be a little bit of damage tweaking for Frost DKs to grant us a little bit more single target burst when it comes to the consistent, more of a Howling Blast consistency spec, because yeah, you could see there it definitely needed something. I could drop off Remorseless Winter and then go Frostworm's Fury, but that does affect my single target DPS quite a bit. But it could be worth it in the long run if we actually wanted to have some good opener damage. So let me know down in the comments below what you think about the new Frost DKs, whether you like the new style, whether you have some ideas for certain builds you want me to test out. Let me know. We'll go ahead and do that. And of course, leave a like. Till next time. This was your boy Hazzed.